The Pacific stretched endlessly before Admiral Kiichi Nagamo as he stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the steel railing. The date was June 3, 1942, and the morning sun painted the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. Behind him, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy, cut through the waves with deadly precision. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, formed a floating fortress of steel and death. Nagumo's mind wandered to the events that had brought them to this moment. 6 months earlier, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the American Pacific Fleet, sending shockwaves across the world. The Japanese war machine had rolled forward with unstoppable momentum, conquering the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Now Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had conceived an even more audacious plan: the complete destruction of what remained of the American naval power in the Pacific. The target was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand that served as America's westernmost outpost. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans had only a handful of aging aircraft and a small garrison. What Nagamo didn't know was that American codebreakers, working tirelessly in basement offices in Hawaii, had already deciphered Japan's intentions. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had cracked the Japanese naval code, revealing not just the target, but the exact timing and composition of the approaching fleet. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative history of the United States naval operations in World War II, the American preparations for this confrontation had been meticulous despite their apparent disadvantage in numbers and firepower. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles to the east, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, studying intelligence reports with grim determination. The soft-spoken Texan had assumed command of the Pacific Fleet after the devastation of December 7th, and now he faced the most crucial decision of his career. With only 3 operational aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, against Japan's 4, the odds seemed impossibly stacked against him. Yorktown presented a particular challenge. She had limped back from the Battle of the Coral Sea with significant damage, her flight deck scarred and her hull compromised. Navy experts estimated 3 months of repairs would be needed to make her battle-ready again. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Around the clock, shipyard workers swarmed over the carrier like ants, welding, hammering, and patching. Sparks flew in the darkness as they raced against time, knowing that every hour brought the Japanese fleet closer to their trap. Captain Mark Mitcher paced the deck of the Hornet, watching his pilots prepare for what many believed might be their final mission. The young aviators, some barely out of their teens, joked nervously as they checked their equipment. They had trained for this moment, but training and reality were vastly different things. The Japanese Zero fighters had proven themselves nearly invincible in air-to-air combat, and the enemy's veteran pilots had honed their skills in the skies over China and Southeast Asia. On Midway itself, Marine Corps' defenders worked frantically to prepare their defenses. Colonel Harold Shannon coordinated the placement of anti-aircraft guns while Navy construction crews reinforced bunkers and fuel storage facilities. Every man on the atoll understood that they were likely to face the full fury of the Japanese attack, serving as both bait and shield for the American carriers lurking beyond the horizon. As the sun set on June 3rd, painting the Pacific in brilliant oranges and purples, both fleets moved inexorably toward their destiny. The Japanese, confident in their superior numbers and battle-tested crews, anticipated another crushing victory. The Americans, outnumbered but forewarned, prepared to stake everything on a single desperate gamble. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval battles, where the fate of the Pacific, and perhaps the entire war, would be determined by courage, skill, and the thin margin between victory and catastrophe. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, hung over the Pacific like a shroud as the Japanese strike force approached Midway Atoll. Aboard the carrier Akagi, flight crews worked by the dim glow of red lights, preparing 108 aircraft for the first wave of attacks. The air vibrated with the throaty rumble of warming engines as Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers and HD-3 Aval dive bombers prepared to unleash destruction upon the American base. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga led the formation. As it lifted off from the carrier decks at 4:30 in the morning, the aircraft climbing into the star-filled sky like a swarm of mechanical wasps. Behind them, the carriers maintained course, their flight decks cleared and ready to receive the returning aircraft. Admiral Nagamo felt confident intelligence reports suggested minimal American resistance, and his pilots were among the most experienced in the world. What Nagamo couldn't know was that American radar operators on Midway had been tracking his approach since 3 in the morning. At 5:34, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a lumbering PBY Catalina flying boat on routine patrol, spotted the Japanese fleet through his binoculars. His radio crackled to life. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150 miles. The message electrified the American defenses. On Midway, air raid sirens wailed across the atoll as Marines scrambled to their battle stations. Colonel Ira Kimes, commanding the Marine Air Group 22, ordered every available aircraft into the air. Ancient Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters, obsolete even by 1942 standards, roared down the runway alongside more modern Grumman 4F Wildcats. Captain John Carey led 26 Marine fighters into the brightening sky, knowing they faced overwhelming odds. The Japanese formation appeared on the horizon like a dark cloud, and within minutes, the sky above Midway erupted into a deadly ballet of twisting, diving aircraft. Zero fighters, their rising sun emblems gleaming in the morning light, tore through the American defensive screen with devastating efficiency. The Zeros, piloted by veterans like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, demonstrated why they had earned such fearsome reputations. Their superior maneuverability and experienced pilots overwhelmed the American defenders. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 Marine fighters had been shot down, their pilots either dead or struggling in the shark-infested waters below. Meanwhile, the Japanese bombers pressed their attack against Midway itself. Bombs fell like deadly rain, exploding fuel storage tanks and destroying buildings. The Marine defenders, crouched in their dugouts and bunkers, felt the earth shake with each explosion. Yet despite the fury of the assault, the critical infrastructure, the airfield runways and fuel facilities remained largely intact. Lieutenant Tomonaga, surveying the damage from his bomber, realized that a second strike would be necessary to completely neutralize the American base. His radio message to Admiral Nagamo would prove to be one of the most fateful communications in naval history. Second attack necessary. Back on the Japanese carriers, Nagamo faced a crucial decision. Half of his aircraft were already armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for potential attacks against American ships. Tomonaga's request meant switching to high-explosive bombs for ground targets, a time-consuming process that would leave the fleet vulnerable. As if to emphasize this danger, American torpedo bombers launched from Midway began their desperate attacks against the Japanese fleet. The ancient Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, flying barely above the wave tops, pressed their attacks with suicidal courage. Captain Langdon Fieberling led 6 Army Air Forces B-26 Marauder medium bombers in a low-level attack, their machine guns blazing as they skimmed across the water. The attacks achieved little material damage, but served a crucial purpose. They forced Nagamo to keep his fighters engaged, preventing him from launching reconnaissance flights that might have discovered the American carrier force lurking 200 miles to the northeast. Unknown to the Japanese admiral, Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Fletcher were positioning their carriers for a devastating counterstrike, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash their own aerial thunderbolt against the unsuspecting enemy fleet. At 7:15 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Admiral Nagamo faced the most critical decision of his naval career. Standing on the bridge of the Akagi, he watched recovery operations as the first wave of aircraft returned from their attack on Midway. Many bore the scars of battle bullet-riddled wings, smoking engines, and bloodied pilots. Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga's bomber had been so badly damaged that its landing gear refused to function properly. The returning pilots confirmed what Tomonaga had radioed earlier. Midway required a second strike to be completely neutralized. This meant rearming the 93 aircraft currently loaded with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship attacks. The process would take precious time, but Nagamo believed the Americans had no significant naval forces in the area. That belief shattered at 7:28, when a reconnaissance float plane from the cruiser Tone finally arrived in the search area it should have reached hours earlier. Pilot Petty Officer First Class Amari Tomonaga peered through his binoculars and spotted the impossible formation of American warships steaming directly toward the Japanese fleet. His radio message crackled across the airwaves. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 010 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagamo's face went ashen. American ships this close meant only one thing: aircraft carriers. The Admiral's mind raced through the implications. If the Americans had carriers, they could launch an attack at any moment. But his own aircraft were in the worst possible configuration for such a threat, some loaded for ground attack, others being rearmed, and his best fighters committed to defending against the continuing harassment attacks from Midway. As referenced in Gordon Prange's definitive work, Miracle at Midway. The next hour would prove to be one of the most chaotic and decisive periods in naval warfare history. At 8:20, Admiral Raymond Spruance, aboard the Enterprise, made the bold decision that would determine the battle's outcome. Against conventional wisdom that called for coordinated attacks, he launched every available aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters immediately. The Hornet and Enterprise launched 116 aircraft in the largest carrier-based airstrike in naval history to that point. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCliskey led 37 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, while Lieutenant Commander John Waldron commanded 15 Devastator torpedo bombers from the Hornet. The aircraft climbed into the morning sky, their pilots knowing that they faced the most experienced naval aviation force in the world. The American formations became separated during the long flight to the target. Waldron's torpedo squadron, flying low and slow, arrived first at the Japanese fleet at 9:20. What followed was a massacre. The 15 Devastators, attacking without fighter escort, flew into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zero fighters. One by one, the American torpedo planes fell into the sea. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, watched from his rubber life raft as his 14 squadron mates died around him. Their sacrifice seemed meaningless. Not a single torpedo struck its target, but the sacrifice was not in vain. The torpedo attacks had drawn the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. At exactly 10:24, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey spotted the Japanese fleet through a break in the clouds. The 4 carriers steamed in a perfect box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. "We've got them," McCluskey radioed to his pilots. "Attack when ready." The Dauntless dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives, screaming down from 14,000 feet at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. Zero fighters, caught out of position by the torpedo attacks, scrambled desperately to intercept the American bombers, but it was too late. At 10:25, The first bomb struck the Akagi's flight deck. Within minutes, secondary explosions from fuel and ammunition turned the proud flagship into a floating inferno. The Kaga and Soryu suffered similar fates as American. Bombs found their marks with devastating accuracy. In the span of 5 minutes. The elite of Japanese naval aviation was transformed from hunters into prey, their carriers burning beneath them. The morning of June 4, 1942, had transformed from triumph to catastrophe for the Imperial Japanese Navy in the span of 5 devastating minutes. Admiral Nagamo stood on the bridge of the burning Akagi, watching in horror as his flagship, the pride of the Japanese fleet, became a floating hell of twisted metal and roaring flames. The sweet smell of aviation gasoline mixed with the acrid smoke of burning aircraft created a toxic cloud that hung over the carrier like a funeral shroud. Below decks, damage control parties fought desperately against the spreading fires. The hangar deck, packed with armed and fueled aircraft, had become a death trap. Secondary explosions rocked the ship as ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. Commander Tajiro Aoki, the ship's damage control officer, led his men through smoke-filled corridors, knowing that each step might be their last. On the Kaga, the situation was equally desperate. Captain Jizaku Okada watched helplessly as his ship listed heavily to port, her flight deck a mass of twisted steel and burning wreckage. The carrier's island superstructure glowed cherry red from the fires raging within. Petty Officer Juzo Mori, trapped in a damage control station, made the ultimate sacrifice by flooding the forward magazines to prevent a catastrophic explosion that would have killed everyone aboard. The Soryu faced a similar fate. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto, following the ancient tradition of Bushido, chose to go down with his ship. As the carrier settled deeper into the Pacific, survivors could hear him singing the national anthem from the bridge, his voice carrying across the water until the flames finally silenced him forever. Yet amid this devastation, one Japanese carrier remained operational. The Hiryu, positioned farther from the main formation, had escaped the initial American attack. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, known throughout the fleet for his aggressive spirit, immediately began planning his counterattack. "We will show the Americans that the Imperial Navy never gives up," he declared to his assembled pilots. At 10:54, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from the Hiryu's deck. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the formation toward the American fleet, determined to exact revenge for his fallen comrades. The Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, flew with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, aboard the American carriers, the mood was one of cautious optimism mixed with grim determination. Admiral Spruance, having witnessed the successful strikes against 3 Japanese carriers, knew the battle was far from over. The 4th carrier remained a deadly threat, and Japanese land-based aircraft from Wake Island and other bases could still intervene. Captain Mitcher, commanding the Hornet, watched anxiously as his remaining aircraft landed with fuel tanks nearly empty and ammunition expended. Many bore the scars of combat bullet holes in wings and fuselages. Wounded pilots slumped over their controls. The deck crews worked frantically to refuel and rearm the aircraft for potential follow-up strikes. At noon, the Japanese counterattack found its target. Kobayashi's dive bombers, guided by reconnaissance aircraft, located the Yorktown. The American carrier, her patches from the Coral Sea battle still visible on her flight deck, became the focus of a determined attack. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire from the surrounding escorts, 3 bombs struck the carrier in quick succession. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, killing or wounding dozens of men. The second bomb knocked out the ship's boilers, bringing her to a dead stop in the water. The third bomb started fires that threatened to reach the aviation fuel storage areas. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered damage control parties to fight the flames while maintaining defensive positions. against further attacks. As referenced in the official U.S. Navy history, the Battle of Midway. The afternoon would bring even more dramatic reversals of fortune as both sides struggled to land decisive blows in this aerial chess match played out over hundreds of square miles of empty ocean. The Yorktown's survival would depend on the skill and courage of her crew, while the fate of the last Japanese carrier hung in the balance. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the Pacific as the crippled Yorktown struggled to maintain her position in the water. Captain Elliot Buckmaster surveyed the damage from his bridge, watching his crew fight the fires that threatened to consume his ship. Despite 3 direct bomb hits, the carrier's damage control parties had performed miracles. Chief Petty Officer John Vrana led teams through smoke-filled compartments, shoring up bulkheads and fighting fires with a determination that bordered on the superhuman. By 1:40, the impossible had been achieved. The Yorktown was moving again. Her engineers had restored power to one boiler, giving her enough speed to launch and recover aircraft. The stars and stripes still flew defiantly from her mainmast, a symbol of American resilience that could be seen for miles across the ocean. But Rear Admiral Yamaguchi aboard the Hiryu was not finished. The Japanese admiral, known for his tactical brilliance and fighting spirit, had launched a second wave of attackers. 10 torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters approached the American fleet at low altitude, their pilots grimly determined to finish what the morning's dive bombers had started. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, despite his aircraft being damaged in the morning's attack on Midway, had volunteered to lead this final assault. His Kate torpedo bomber, patched and repaired by dedicated ground crews, carried the hopes of the entire Japanese fleet. As he approached the American formation, Tominaga could see the Yorktown steaming in the center, her flight deck clear and ready for operations. The American Combat Air Patrol, led by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch in his F-4F Wildcat, intercepted the Japanese formation 15 miles from the fleet. The sky erupted in a deadly dogfight as Wildcats and Zeros twisted and turned in mortal combat. Thatch's innovative thatch-weave defensive formation helped level the playing field against the superior Japanese fighters, but several torpedo bombers broke through the defensive screen. At 2:45, disaster struck the Yorktown again. 2 torpedoes, launched by Tominaga's aircraft in his final act of sacrifice, slammed into the carrier's port side. The massive explosions tore huge holes in her hull, flooding the engine rooms and causing a severe list to port. This time, the damage was beyond repair. Captain Buckmaster, realizing his ship was doomed, gave the order to abandon ship. Across the carrier's loudspeakers, his voice carried the weight of command and sorrow. All hands, abandon ship. I repeat, all hands, abandon ship. The crew, many of them teenagers far from home, began the orderly evacuation they had drilled countless times, but never expected to perform in combat. Yet, even as the Yorktown died, her sacrifice was not in vain. Admiral Spruance had already launched a final strike against the Hiryu. 24 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, climbed into the afternoon sky with vengeance in their hearts. Their target was the last operational Japanese carrier, the final symbol of the Imperial Navy's Pacific dominance. At 5:05, Gallagher's dive bombers found the Hiryu steaming desperately northward. The Japanese carrier, her flight deck empty of aircraft, looked strangely vulnerable after the morning's carnage. 4 bombs struck the ship in rapid succession, turning her flight deck into an inferno identical to those that had consumed her. Sister ships. Admiral Yamaguchi, standing on the Hiryu's bridge as flames engulfed his flagship, understood that the battle, and perhaps the entire war, had been lost. The samurai tradition demanded that he go down with his ship, and he prepared to meet his fate with the stoic dignity of his ancestors. As the fires spread and the crew abandoned ship, Yamaguchi remained at his post, his silhouette visible against the orange glow of the burning carrier. By sunset on June 4, 1942, 4 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest aircraft carriers lay burning or beneath the waves. With them died the cream of Japanese naval aviation pilots who could never be replaced, mechanics whose skills had been honed through years of experience, and aircraft that represented the peak of Japanese engineering. The storm that Midway had unleashed was complete, and the tide of war in the Pacific had turned forever. The twilight hours of June 4, 1942, painted the Pacific in shades of crimson that seemed to mirror the blood spilled in the day's carnage. Across hundreds of square miles of ocean, the debris of the once mighty Japanese striking force drifted on the swells. Pieces of aircraft, life rafts filled with survivors, and the burning hulks of what had been the pride of the Imperial Navy. Admiral Nagamo, rescued from the blazing Akagi by the destroyer Milwaukee, stood on the bridge watching his flagship's death throes. The carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor now listed heavily to starboard, her flight deck twisted and blackened by fires that had been burning for nearly 8 hours. Explosions continued to rock the hull as ammunition and fuel tanks detonated, sending columns of flame and smoke high into the darkening sky. The Akagi's captain, Taijiro Aoki, had been among the last to leave his ship. The veteran officer, tears streaming down his soot-stained face, saluted his burning command one final time before stepping into the waiting rescue boat. Behind him, the carrier's rising sun flag still flew from the mainmast, a defiant gesture that would soon be claimed by the Pacific depths. Similar scenes played out across the task force. The Kaga, her back broken by internal explosions, had already slipped beneath the waves at 7:25, taking with her the bodies of 800 officers and men. Captain Jizaku Okada had survived, but the weight of losing his ship and so many of his crew aged him decades in a single day. The Soryu had followed her sisters into the abyss at 7:15, her captain choosing to remain aboard in accordance with naval tradition. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi aboard the Hiryu had made the same choice, standing on his bridge as the flames consumed the last of Japan's striking power. His final radio message to Admiral Yamamoto was simple and profound. "Our aircraft and ships are gone. We have fought with honor." Meanwhile, the American fleet was conducting its own grim accounting. The Yorktown, abandoned but still afloat, drifted helplessly with a severe list to port. Her crew, rescued by destroyers and cruisers, watched from the decks of other ships as their homes slowly died. Many wept openly, mourning not just the loss of their ship, but the deaths of shipmates who had become family during long months at sea. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, his Wildcat fighter riddled with bullet holes, managed to land on the Enterprise just as darkness fell. The young pilot, exhausted from hours of aerial combat, climbed from his cockpit and immediately began helping deck crews prepare for possible night attacks. The Japanese fleet, though savaged, still included battleships and cruisers that could pose a threat under cover of darkness. Admiral Spruance, aboard the Enterprise, faced a crucial decision as night approached. Intelligence reports suggested that Admiral Yamamoto's main battle fleet, including the super battleship Yamato, was still approaching from the west. The prudent course would be to withdraw eastward, preserving his remaining carriers for future battles. But the aggressive option, pursuing the retreating Japanese forces, might yield even greater results. In the end, Spruance chose caution over aggression, a decision that would be debated by naval historians for decades to come. The American fleet turned eastward, content with having inflicted the greatest defeat in Japanese naval history. Behind them, rescue operations continued throughout the night as destroyers and cruisers searched for survivors among the burning wreckage. Petty Officer Juzo Mori, floating in a life raft after the Kaga's sinking, watched the last fires fade. On the horizon, the young sailor who had enlisted with dreams of naval glory now understood the true cost of war. Around him, other survivors huddled in shock, trying to comprehend how complete victory had turned to utter defeat in the span of a single day. As referenced in Mitsuo Fuchida's first-hand account, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan. The night of June 4th marked not just the end of a battle, but the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The morning of June 5th, 1942, dawned gray and overcast, as if the Pacific itself mourned the previous day's carnage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard the super battleship Yamato 300 miles to the west, received the final damage reports with the stoic composure that had made him Japan's most respected naval officer. 4 aircraft carriers sunk, over 3,000 men dead or missing, and the elite of Japanese naval aviation destroyed in a single day. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood immediately what the disaster meant for Japan's war effort. Without the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the Imperial Navy had lost its ability to project power across the vast Pacific. More critically, the veteran pilots who had died in the flames, men like Mitsuo Fuchida and Minoru Genda, represented years of training and experience that could never be replaced. Yamamoto's staff officers urged him to continue the operation, to use his battleships and cruisers to bombard Midway into submission. The admiral listened to their arguments with growing frustration. How could they not see that the fundamental balance of power had shifted? Without air cover, his battle fleet would be sitting ducks for American bombers flying from Midway and the surviving carriers. "The operation is canceled," Yamamoto announced quietly. "We return to Japan immediately." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, not just for the Midway operation, but for Japan's hopes of victory in the Pacific. The fleet that had once seemed invincible began its long retreat toward home waters, leaving behind the graves of ships and men in the deep Pacific. Meanwhile, American forces were conducting their own somber rituals. The Yorktown, despite Herculean efforts to save her, finally succumbed to her wounds at dawn on June 7th. The destroyer Hammond, attempting to provide power and pumping assistance, was struck by torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-168 and sank within minutes. The deaths of 81 sailors aboard the Hammond served as a final reminder that the Pacific War was far from over. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, standing aboard the cruiser Astoria, watched his former command slip beneath the waves. The Yorktown had served her country well, from the Coral Sea to her final sacrifice at Midway. Her loss was mourned, but her sacrifice had helped secure one of the most decisive victories in American naval history. The strategic implications of the Battle of Midway became clear in the weeks and months that followed. Japan's ability to conduct major offensive operations had been shattered. The initiative in the Pacific War had passed permanently to the United States, which now possessed the industrial capacity and naval strength to begin the long drive toward the Japanese home islands. For the surviving Japanese pilots and sailors, the journey home was one of profound soul-searching. Petty Officer First Class Kiyoshi Ogawa, rescued from the waters after the Soryu sinking, spent weeks in a hospital ship reflecting on the hubris that had led to such catastrophe. The mythology of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War, had been shattered in 5 minutes of American dive bombing. The American victory at Midway also marked the emergence of a new generation of naval leaders. Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose calm tactical decisions had proven decisive, would go on to command fleet operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. Pilots like John Thatch and Wade McCleskey became legends whose tactics and leadership would influence naval aviation for generations to come. As the news of the victory reached the American mainland, a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor found new hope and determination. President Franklin Roosevelt, addressing the nation from the White House, declared that the tide has turned in the Pacific. Factory workers across America redoubled their efforts, understanding that each ship, aircraft, and weapon they produced brought the war's end closer. The storm that Midway had unleashed upon the Japanese fleet had indeed changed everything. In the space of 4 days, the course of the Pacific War had been altered forever, setting the stage for the eventual Allied victory and the dawn of a new era in world history.